Hey everybody, welcome back to Fed News, your UCW and UWF head-to-head competition. Of course, it's the fake wrestling news, it's not real, but let's get started anyway. So, in wrestling news, Doug Summers in talks with UWA Developmental, and the UWF International Championship is actually being renamed to just the UWF European Champion. Obviously, that will be taking place forward going from here on out, as an NXT brand is expected, so belts were decided to go from that pool of potential representatives just to the European title. All right, so week one kicks off with Ken Shamrock defeating Cassius Ohno. Excuse me, my voice a little rough with submission. Redragon defeat Cade Murdoch by pinfall. The main event sees Alex Wright defeat Paul Orndorff to become the new Hardcore Champion. Over to Nitro now as the Hurricane defeats Zeus. Test defeats Juventud Guerrera. Raven defeats Don Morocco. And Mike Kanellis and Bam Bam Bigelow end a double countout. The main event sees Randy Orton defeat King Kong Bundy by pinfall. Over to the SmackDown Brownies, Hart Dynasty defeats Rick Rude and Kevin Sullivan by pinfall. Big Boss Man Bull Buchanan versus Reggie and Norman Smiley ends in a double countout. And Giant Gonzalez defeats the Road Dogg to retain the Hardcore title. Over to the main show now as Sylvan defeats Roddy Piper by pinfall. Jey Uso defeats Simon Diamond by pinfall. Yokozuna defeats Spike Dudley by pinfall. Bob Backlund defeats Brian Knobbs by submission. The main event sees Cody Rhodes and Animal end in a double countout. Obviously, they were competing to become the number one contender for the Intercontinental title, as they were the last two sole survivors. So they will end up having to face each other again in the coming weeks to determine who gets to face Cesaro. The UCW match card looks like this: Rock and Roll Express versus Harlem Heat, Rhino versus Macho Man Randy Savage, Test versus Randy Orton versus Andre the Giant, Sting versus Hardcore for the U.S. title, the Highlanders versus Phil LaFrawn and Doug Furnas versus the champions Motor City Machine Guns. Orlando Jordan looks to take on Kurt Angle for the TV title, and The Rock looks to take on The Big Show for the World Heavyweight title. And over to Thunder now as Alex Wright defeats Roderick Strong to retain the Hardcore title. Austin Theory defeats Moose by pinfall. Redragons defeated Power and Glory and Chronic by pinfall to become the USA Tag Team Champions. And the main event sees Rey Mysterio defeat Adam Cole to retain the Cruiserweight title. Over to Super Bowl, Orlando Jordan defeats Kurt Angle to become the new TV champion. Randy Orton defeats Test and Andre the Giant by pinfall. Phil LaFrawn and Doug Furnas defeat Highlanders and Motor City Machine Guns to become the tag team champions. Sting and Hardcore Holly end in a double countout. Harlem Heat defeats Rock and Roll Express. Rhino picks up the victory over Macho Man Randy Savage, and The Rock becomes the new UCW World Heavyweight Champion. Kicking off week two now is Tatanka defeats Muhammad Ali by pinfall. Cade and Murdoch defeat Chronic and Power and Glory by pinfall. Ken Shamrock defeats Alex Wright to become the Hardcore Champion. However, Paul Orndorff defeats Don Morocco on Nitro. Rock and Roll Express defeats the Highlanders. Rhino defeats Test by pinfall. Bam Bam Bigelow defeats Macho Man Randy Savage by pinfall. And Orlando Jordan retains over Kurt Angle for the TV title in the main event. Over to SmackDown now is Bull Buchanan and Big Boss Man defeated Norman Smiley and Reggie by pinfall. Ezekiel Jackson defeats Carl Anderson and Mr. Ass Billy Gunn by pinfall. The main event sees Giant Gonzalez retain his Hardcore title over Simon Dean. Over to Raw now as Johnny Gargano defeats Randy Rose by submission. Jerry Lynn defeats A-Train by pinfall. Heath Slater and Justin Gabriel defeat Gemini and Titus O'Neil by pinfall. Brian Pillman defeats Chris Candido by pinfall. The main event sees Owen Hart retain over William Regal for the European Championship, the newly christened UWF European Championship. Week 3 kicks off with Tatanka defeating Cassius Ohno. Eric Young and Moose defeat Adam Cole and Roderick Strong by pinfall. Ken Shamrock retains over Alex Wright by pinfall for the Hardcore title. Over to WCW Nitro now as Paul Orndorff versus King Kong Bundy ends in a double countout. Raven defeats Mike Kanellis by pinfall. Randy Orton defeats Juventud Guerrera by pinfall. Andre the Giant defeats Zeus by pinfall. And Bam Bam Bigelow defeats Rhino by pinfall. Over to SmackDown now as the Hart Dynasty defeats the Singh Brothers. Big Boss Man and Bull Buchanan defeat New Age Outlaws by pinfall. The main event sees Ezekiel Jackson defeat Giant Gonzalez by pinfall for the Hardcore title. Over to Raw as Sylvan defeats Marty Jannetty. Yokozuna defeats Hawk. Jey Uso defeats Larry Zbyszko. Brian Pillman defeats William Regal. And Cody Rhodes defeats Animal to become the new number one contender for the Intercontinental title. Over to week 4 now as Power and Glory defeats Rey Mysterio and Austin Theory by pinfall. Chronic defeats Eric Young and Moose by pinfall. Tatanka upsets Ken Shamrock and becomes the new Hardcore Champion. Over to WC Nitro now as Paul Orndorff defeats King Kong Bundy. Motor City Machine Guns defeat the Hurricane and Juventud Guerrera by pinfall. Test defeats Macho Man Randy Savage by pinfall. Kurt Angle defeats Bam Bam Bigelow and Randy Orton by pinfall. And Orlando Jordan retains his TV title over Andre the Giant by countout. Over to SmackDown as Rick Rude and Carl Anderson in a double countout. Hart Dynasty defeats Big Boss Man and Bull Buchanan by pinfall. The main event sees Giant Gonzalez defeat Ezekiel Jackson to regain the Hardcore Championship, now being a 5-time Hardcore Champion. Over to Raw now as Roddy Piper defeats A-Train. Jerry Lynn defeats Spike Dudley. Jey Uso defeats Sylvan. Heath Slater and Justin Gabriel defeat LOD. They now have a shot at the tag titles. And in the main event, Owen Hart defeats Bob Backlund to retain his European Championship. Kicking off the pay-per-view of Ground Zero, the card is going to be Brian Pillman versus Yokozuna, Jey Uso versus Jerry Lynn versus Owen Hart for the European title, Heath Slater and Justin Gabriel versus Braun Breaker and The Fiend for the tag belts, Cody Rhodes versus Cesaro for the IC title, William Regal versus Roddy Piper versus Johnny Gargano versus Bob Backlund in a fatal 4-way, Jake Gemini versus Sylvan. This came about as just a match as both men showed a great impressive showing at Royal Rumble with the most eliminations, 1 and 2, and the main event sees Batista, who had returned at the last pay-per-view at the bragging rights, returning for a shot at the world title against Shinsuke Nakamura. Over to SmackDown now as Rick Rude defeats Carl Anderson by pinfall. Psychosis defeats Road Dogg, Jesse James, and Kevin Sullivan by pinfall in a triple threat. Mr. Ass Billy Gunn defeats Johnny Gonzalez to become the Hardcore Champion now a 3rd time. And the main event, Dudley's defeat the Hart Dynasty retain the UWF USA Tag Team Championship. Ground Zero, Jerry Lynn defeats Jey Uso and Owen Hart to become the new European Champion. Jake Gemini defeats Sylvan by pinfall. Heath Slater and Justin Gabriel defeat The Fiend and Braun Breaker by pinfall. Brian Pillman defeats Yokozuna by pinfall. Cody Rhodes defeats Cesaro by pinfall. Bob Backlund defeated Johnny Gargano, Roddy Piper, and William Regal by pinfall. And the main event sees Shinsuke Nakamura defeat Batista to retain the UWF World Heavyweight Championship. Your UWF champions. You've got, obviously, Mr. Ass, the Hardcore Champion. Cody's winning the Intercontinental. Jerry Lynn winning the European. Heath Slater and Justin Gabriel become the new tag champions. Over to UCW now is Doug Furnas and Phil Lefron win the tag belts. Orlando is the TV champion still. Hardcore is still a U.S. champion. The Rock's the new world champion. Tatanka and the Redragons also becoming new champions, first-time champions. That's all for this week. Tune in next week as we head towards the UWF's WrestleMania and the UCW's Slamboree.